Today, we're going to look at conflict through a really different lens. We're stepping away from the usual talk of geopolitics and military tactics to explore war as something deeply, deeply psychological.
So let's just jump right in with a pretty provocative idea. What if the wars we see on the news aren't just about strategy or territory? What if they're actually a kind of performance, a type of theater? That's the core question we're digging into today. Psychoanalyst Sara Shadabi has this fascinating take on it. She suggests that war can act like a stage. It's a place where a leader or a country isn't just fighting an opponent, but they're performing an idea of power for the whole world to see, and maybe, even more importantly, for themselves. But, what's really driving this performance, this huge display of force? It often doesn't come from a place of pure strength. Actually, it can be a defense mechanism, a way to push back against some really deep-seated anxieties, like the fear of losing control, or looking weak, or facing instability.
And this brings us to a really crucial psychological idea: denial. In this case, we're talking about a total refusal to accept any limits or vulnerability. It's the belief that if you just use enough force, you can bend reality to your will. Solve these super complex problems with one simple, decisive action, even when all the evidence says that's just not going to work.
So this performance of denial, it creates what we can call a spectacle of power. It's a leader using the theater of war to project a very, very specific image of themselves to everyone, their own people, their enemies, and the world at large.
And what's the image they're trying to sell? Well, it's one of total decisiveness, absolute control, complete command, and, mastery over every single event. The goal is to create this fantasy that someone is 100% in charge.
So here's the key takeaway. It's not just about the military action itself. The perception of authority is just as important. That image of control can be way more valuable than winning a single battle, because it keeps your supporters on board and it can intimidate your rivals.
But, and this is a huge but, what happens when the performance starts to fail? What if that war that was supposed to be short and symbolic and totally under control just spirals into a long, grinding, messy conflict? Well, that's the turning point. That's when the whole illusion begins to crack.
You see, as the war drags on, that intended image of strength suddenly starts to look a lot like desperate overreach. The performance of mastery gives way to a very public loss of control. And that projected decisiveness, it starts to look more like desperation or even panic. Suddenly, the gap between the image and reality is just too big to ignore.
And this is the great irony in all of this. The exact same tool, the war, that was meant to project this image of invincibility becomes the very stage where that image gets torn apart in front of everyone. The performance completely backfires.
At this point, the biggest danger isn't the enemy on the battlefield anymore. It's a crisis of legitimacy. It's what happens when the audience, both at home and abroad, stops believing in the show. Because at the end of the day, authority only works if people think you're credible.
And this usually leads to a pretty predictable chain reaction. First, the spectacle fails to convince people. Then, that carefully built image cracks. As that happens, authority starts to erode from the inside, and ultimately, you risk a total loss of legitimacy.
Now, this whole crisis doesn't just happen at the top political levels. No, it seeps down into the very fabric of society itself. There's a term for this: societal attrition. It's when that draining, relentless feeling of war is no longer a distant thing you see on TV, but a part of your everyday life.
And what does that actually feel like for regular people? Well, it feels like you're just exhausted all the time. It's living with this pervasive uncertainty, dealing with rising prices and insecurity, and just having this constant low-grade buzz of threat in the background of your life.
From there, things can get even more dangerous. You can get to a stage where a crisis becomes normal. A society just gets used to living in this state of permanent tension. And here's the scary part: power stops trying to fix the anxiety and instead starts to use it, feeding on the very instability it created to demand more obedience and justify more force.
A big part of this process is something called projection. This is where a leader's own fears of chaos, of their own weakness, of things falling apart, get pushed outward. They get located in the enemy. So the enemy becomes the one who's chaotic, the enemy is the one who's weak, the enemy is the source of all the instability.
This is what psychoanalysts call acting out. Basically, instead of thinking through a problem, power just responds with more action, more escalation. Brute force takes the place of diplomacy, and destruction becomes a substitute for actually understanding the situation. It's a total shutdown of any thoughtful engagement.
And so this brings us to the final, incredible paradox of it all. This desperate attempt to perform absolute strength, to deny any and all weakness, ultimately becomes the most powerful proof of a deep, underlying fragility.
It's really summed up perfectly here. The very act that was designed to hide a weakness ends up being the thing that exposes it for the entire world to see. The mask falls off, and the reality underneath is just laid bare.
So, we want to leave you with this question to chew on. The next time you see a grand performance of political or military power, ask yourself, what is this really about? What anxiety, what weakness, what deep-seated fear is this entire spectacle trying to hide from us and from itself?